All right, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, anyway, back to the story. We're looking at Horsey number 3, all right? And the question is, what are the powers that be up to? Now, if you tried to read through this, you're going to get stuck in the weeds. Okay, there's a lot of crazy stuff that's going on, but it speaks very well to the feudal system. All right. So even though the screencasters are not going to get to appreciate the drawing, okay, that I'm about to make, all right, you guys will appreciate it and then they can ask about it. All right. But it really just deals with 2 states, if you will. Who are they? The 100 Years' War is fought between who? Yeah, France and England, and we don't really know quite yet what a France is. All right. So that's kind of part of the story. And does everybody know that one of the original kings of England was William the Conqueror, right? Where did he come from? Came from France. Okay, the Norman conquest, it's called the Battle of Hastings, all right? But in 1066, the Norman conqueror becomes the king of England, and then all of his successors are basically coming from that spot. It also means that a lot of the areas in what comprises France is still territory that is controlled by that family. Does everybody kind of understand what I'm talking about? Because in the Middle Ages, the state stuff doesn't really make any sense. All right. In the Middle Ages, and England probably is about as close to being England as you could possibly have, and then up here is Scotland, and then Ireland's over here. Maybe that's Wales. And then across the channel here, you got France. But France is broken up into all these little pieces. Okay. And when I draw crap like this, it's basically telling you that state is decentralized. Okay. When you have a geographically intact place with one state or one political leader like England does, we know that's England. And we still do have a recognition of a king of England. And England does kind of at least have some semblance of a national character. But France isn't really France, except for the fact that you have French kings. In this case, it's a dynasty called the Capetians. It goes back to like the past Charlemagne when all that stuff got broken up. I don't know if anybody learned that, but in the Middle Ages, Charlemagne was a big superstar emperor, and then when he died, the kingdom sort of broke up into 3 different pieces. Where one of them, this is called the Treaty of Verdun, but it's in 843. And modern Europe is more or less built off of Charlemagne's inheritance, breaking into 3 grandsons. Okay, one of them was called Charles the Bold. That becomes France. One of them was called Louis the German. That became Germany. And the 3rd grandson was Lothair. And Lothair is basically this unsolved thing between Italy all the way up to the Netherlands, called the Middle Kingdom. All right? But in the Middle Ages, the power that is really being held in the Middle Ages is being held by local nobles. Those are people that we would call dukes or counts or whatever, or earls in the case of other places. But the real power there, who centrally controls those territories, is direct, but it's territorial, meaning like little provinces. So you don't really identify as somebody that is French. You would identify as somebody that comes from Brittany, and you would have a Duke of Brittany or something like that. Okay. And that's what kind of gets weird in this little story, is because of this Norman invasion, all right, your English kings, almost from the get-go, I'll draw another little pretty map here. Sorry. Some of this territory up here is going to be controlled by the English king. Okay? So even though we recognize a king of France, you end up in this really weird situation where territory of France is held by the English king, and then they establish what's called a lord-vassal relationship. Okay? Where you could be the king of one place, and then you could be the lord of another place that kind of defers to the king of another place. It's a really, really screwy little situation. Okay? But it basically shows you that France, more than any place, and really this is a lot of Europe, right, is decentralized, which means that the real political power is being held locally by dukes, and you might have a kingdom and a king recognized, but the king is nominal, which means I am a king in name only, but I haven't really centralized my authority. And that's really what this story is about. Okay, it goes back, even further than this, but they did talk about the Treaty of Paris. And when we get to our story, we get to this Edward versus Philip, but that Edward versus Philip is the end of a really long story. Okay, so I'm going to give you some other names that I think are important here. Okay, in England, it's going to be a line that starts with a family called the Plantagenets. Okay, so England has the Plantagenets. You guys don't have to lose your minds over this stuff. Probably going to tell you at the end of class that you don't need to know any of this. And France has a group called the Capetians. All right? And the Plantagenets, at the height of their power, is under a king by the name of Henry II. This is going to be like mid-13th century. Actually, it's mid-12th century. Okay? Henry II. Okay? Capetians, weak. England, strong. Which means that the Plantagenets, not only have they consolidated their territory in the north of France, but Henry also, through marriage, which is a really cool way to bring in a whole lot of territory, married into the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is this region down here. Really, really rich farmland, a lot of resources. Aquitaine is a big acquisition. And it comes because Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? And that means more of France is under England's control. Okay? So you fast forward a little bit, and around the turn of the 14th century, between the end of the 1300s and into the 1400s, you end up with, at the end of the 1100s and into the 1200s, that's around the time where the Crusades get really cooked up. So if you've ever learned about the Crusades or heard of like Richard the Lionhearted, which is really just Richard the First. And the Capetians also had a pretty powerful king by the name of Philip II Augustus. Okay? And then the roles switch. Philip Augustus is a really, really powerful king in France. Richard the Lionhearted spent almost the entirety of his reign on crusades on behalf of the Pope, which means that the power, sort of in proxy, was a guy named King John. If anybody's ever watched Robin Hood, you might have heard of King John. Okay? King John was the weakest king England ever had. Okay? And in the process, he got embarrassed by the Pope. He got embarrassed by his own people, which is why they had the Magna Carta and the creation of the Parliament. And then he also lost a bunch of territory militarily to Philip II Augustus, who is now fighting for these territories because Philip Augustus is trying to centralize France, meaning bring more and more of it under his direct political control. So by the early 1200s, we're moving in that direction. By the time we get there, France is growing a little bit stronger. England's getting a little bit weaker. England's toehold on this territory is starting to dwindle a little bit. Then we get to the heirs of both of those Capetians. So we had Philip Augustus, and this is, say 1220 to around 1260 or so. King John is the same thing, about 1220 to whatever. Obviously, maybe 1210 to 1250. By the time we get to the end of the 1200s, we have another battle that takes place where the King of England is Edward I Longshanks, and then a very, very powerful king known as Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair is the French king. Edward is the English king, and both of them are powerful.
Wait, so Edward is French?
Edward is English.
Philip is French.
Philip is French.
And you just
Yeah.
getting Phillips and Edwards until
That's basically how it's going to fly. Yeah, because the names that you're going to hear when you get into your reading for the 100 Years' War is going to be a Philip on one side, and it's going to be an Edward on the other side. All right, but I'm trying to get you to Edward III because he's the one that kind of matters at the beginning of the 100 Years' War. Yes, question. That's Longshanks. Yeah, from Braveheart. Although Braveheart lied about a lot of stuff. Yeah, Braveheart, the movie, took some poetic license with some of the stuff. Like Braveheart, had a relationship with Edward's daughter-in-law, and then they had a child, and then she like whispers in his ear in his deathbed that the future King of England is going to be William Wallace's son. That didn't happen. All right. So anyway, long story short here, Edward Longshanks and Philip are continuing a fight that's been going on for hundreds of years. Edward is upset by the territorial losses that took place when Philip Augustus was in power and King John was in power. So he's basically going to bring armies into the northern part of France. And yes, because of Braveheart, he's also dealing with Scottish uprisings at the same time. Okay? I haven't gotten to that yet, but that's going to be the preoccupation. So, in the late 1200s, Edward's armies are fighting against Philip the Fair's armies over who controls territories in northern France. And it's expensive, and it takes a while. And then eventually they get to an idea that we're starting to drain resources, and we're both preoccupied with other things. The thing that Edward is most preoccupied with is Scotland fighting for their independence. The thing that Philip is most preoccupied with is the Pope. And I haven't gotten to that yet. That's for the next thing. Okay? So they try to make nice. How do kings make nice after they've been in a fight? What do those treaties usually entail? Marriages. Hey, let's marry our families into each other, and that will be our way of showing that we're at peace. Okay? So Longshanks has a son. That's Edward II. Philip has a daughter. Her name is Isabella. Let's marry Edward II and Isabella, and that's basically like us, crushing our little beef. Okay? So everybody follow so far? Okay?
Why would Isabella from France marry the King of England?
Because it's a way of stabilizing the relationship. Okay? And that means that there's going to be French heirs potentially. Okay? But that's like Europe is really famous for like marrying into like politically like big families. Like Catherine the Great of Russia. Where does she come from? She's German. Okay. Marie Antoinette, where does she come from? Austria. Okay. That's a way for them to be able to make peace, is to try to marry their families together. It's, before diplomacy, where you'd actually go and sit down and negotiate, they would just try to solidify, the wealth and the prestige of each other's families, and they would marry in. Okay.
So Isabella from France marries Edward II.
Yeah. And what that means is Isabella is told, hey, we found your husband, pack your stuff. And Isabella's probably, like 12 years old at the time, right? Okay. So anyway, we get there. The story goes, Edward dies, Philip the Fair dies. We're now getting closer to the beginning of our 100 Years' War. Okay. Isabella and Edward have a child. Okay. That's important. So if you're watching the line, and I'll give you this later, but let's just say, like, I've kind of given you some names here. And I give you France. All right. And England's got some Edwards. So here's Edward I. Okay. And he's fighting against Philip IV. Okay. And then Edward and Philip. Philip has a daughter named Isabella. Edward has Edward II. Edward II and Isabella have a relationship. They're married. They have a child, Edward III. Okay? That's important because Edward III's grandpa is Edward I of England and King Philip the Fair of France. You guys see where this is going? Okay. There's other things that are going on. Isabella and Edward, there's some belief that maybe they never even consummated the marriage. There was always a question on whether Edward was a real blood relative. Okay. Because Isabella, they found out that Edward was not really fond of Isabella's. Edward was more into some of the male courtesans or courtiers that were in England. Okay. So Isabella kind of got bored with old Ed too, and she found herself, a boyfriend. His name was Roger Mortimer, and there was a time period after Scotland had gotten their independence where they saw Edward as being potentially a threat. Okay, like he wasn't strong enough to hold England. So all of a sudden he mysteriously died. So Edward II, supposedly the way that the story goes is that he was murdered. Roger Mortimer, who was the mister of Isabella, got a crew together, and they ended up like grabbing this. Like, has everybody ever seen like where you poke the fire to get it going? Yeah, they had made that really hot, and they kind of put it someplace where maybe it wasn't all that comfortable.
Wait, so Roger Mortimer conspired with some people to kill Edward II?
Right.
And he was probably like 70 by the time.
Right. They're not going to recognize Roger Mortimer as the King of England then. It's like, Prince Philip or somebody like that. It's not going to happen. Okay. Isabella is ultimately going to serve as regent, but when Edward III, the future heir to the throne of England, becomes old enough, he becomes the King of England. Okay. Yes.
Who's Henry II's French counterpart?
I honestly don't know because I don't think there's some Louis that go back then, but if you look at like a lot of the French kings in the 1100s, they're not all that strong. Okay. The real power in England or in France in the 12th century were dukes from various regions. They were the ones that led a lot of the crusades in the 12th century. Okay. Yeah. Question.
So do English people all know French and the French people know English? When they intermarry,
Yeah, they're the educated generally find languages that they can speak together. And back then, French would have been preferred over English.
or does it really not matter if you don't know how to speak?
Yeah, or you don't even spend a lot of time together. We're going to talk about some marriages that were marriages, but nobody ever left where they were. Remember, Bloody Mary before Queen Elizabeth in England married Philip II of Spain, but Philip II never left Spain. And Mary never really left England. They just kind of said, we're going to make this sort of a long-distance relationship. All right. But it's done for politics. It's not done for romance. Okay? This is all about political relationships. Yeah, Julius.
So I'm really confused.
It's confusing.
About what you said about the Plantagens and the Capetians.
Yeah.
So Henry II, which was...
These are Plantagenets. It's a family, okay? In the same way that the Bourbons are a family, or the Habsburgs are a family, or the Windsors are a family. Okay. We don't say King Charles III. We call him Chuck Windsor, right? No, we don't. We call him King Charles III. But this guy would be Ed Plantagenet. All right? The Plantagenet dynasty is not dead yet. Okay? But the Capetian dynasty is going to die. All right? Because after Philip the Fair, and because the crown passes on to male heirs, if you look at the lineage, right around the time that Edward III is solidifying himself as an adult king of England, the Capetian line's going to die.
He's going to go with the English Plantagenets.
Right. So here's the scenario, okay? And remember, think of all the wars that have been fought here, okay? And I'm telling you right now that the most important part of this is Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a huge, huge, huge territory And it gets to a point after a while where a couple of things are going to happen. When the Capetian line dies, the strongest male heir to the throne of France is Edward III. He's got blood grandson relationships with the King of France and the King of England at the same time. Okay? But they don't go for that. And in fact, Edward III wasn't even trying to go for it. He's like, look, I'm the King of England. I spent all my time in England. These are my people. I would rather just defer to somebody that is going to become the King of France. So when the nobles are looking for who's going to become the new King of France, it spawns onto a new family called the House of Valois. Valois. Okay? And the guy that they elect is this Philip VI of Valois. Okay? And so it gets weird because Edward initially has no problem with Philip VI of Valois. He's like, all right, cool. You know, you guys made your decision. The way that the nobles figured it out was to say, we don't recognize any heirs through the female line because his link to France is through his mom, not through his dad, Edward. It's called Salic law, but they basically found this old Germanic law to say, we don't recognize Edward III because there's a lot of people that didn't want England and France to be tied together with one leader. Yeah. Okay? And Edward III's like, dope, that's great. I'm cool with that. The only thing that I'm going to ask for is that you respect my territorial rights to Aquitaine. Okay? Philip VI's response, sadly, would have been the same as Philip IV's response or the same as Philip Augustus' response, is that France from the beginning to the end of the 12th century and now continuing through the 1200s and then continuing into the 1300s was to centralize France, to reduce all of the, like those little scribbles that I show you, and turn it into a France, where the French king has direct political control over those territories. That's his move. That's what he wants to accomplish. And Edward wants to maintain control of his family's birthrights, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, which has been in the family since the 1100s. That's the fight. Okay? So when Philip says, nah, we don't really want to give you access to the Duchy of Aquitaine or Duchy or whatever you want to call it, and Philip's like, you know, my move is going to be to make France look like England. One centralized authority, the king is recognized. There's your 100 Years' War. They're fighting over these little territorial squabbles and whose birthright belongs to that birthright, and they end up fighting a 116-year war to figure it out. Okay? But it's worse than that because Edward III, remember, he still has in his hip pocket, I am the cleanest heir to the throne in France. So if you back me, and that's the other thing, is that when you're a noble and a landowner, somebody that possesses territory, you got some decisions to make. Like what happens if England wins and you were fighting on Philip VI's side? So it's not a clean war. It's not England v. France. At the very beginning, it's England v. portions of France. And then England's got allies in other portions of France because some of those English nobles are going to back up, or some of those French nobles are going to back up the English king, thinking if I'm on the winning side, I'll get more estates or I might get more territory. I'll get more favor. Yeah.
So basically, like, who respects the Salic law
Mhm.
versus who respects...
I think the Salic law was probably BS.
No, yeah.
Yeah, they're just trying to come up with some justification for what they're doing. And remember, like I said, the significance here is really about Aquitaine. Like if Ed was like, you know what, like Napoleon did, like, I don't need that third of the United States, just take it. Here, you write me a check. What do you want it for? Okay, that would have solved a lot of problems. Okay, but these kings were still in England and still wanted to be able to press rights, not just the Duchy of Aquitaine, but wanted to remember Edward Longshanks had fought wars in France, in the northern part of France, because he wanted to recapture stuff that was under English control since the days of the Normans. Okay, now he's got an excuse. Okay. Maybe it's my armies are stronger. Maybe it's I've got allies on the French side because it's not just England v. France. It's England v. Some of the duchies of France versus other duchies. So the French king doesn't even have the support of the entire country. Right? He's got a support of a handful of places, and then he's going to be the enemy of other places, including the Burgundians. The Burgundians were big English allies. Okay. And then you also have to look at it from the perspective of has everybody heard of Flanders and not like that goofy character from The Simpsons? Okay. Flanders is important because Flanders is where there's a whole bunch of real economic value. Okay. The Flemish wool industry is big, but they rely on the importation of English wool. So if you are a French landowner in Flanders, okay, you kind of have a stake in making sure that England might win the war because you need those imports. You need those woolen textiles. Everybody kind of understand how it's complicated right now? And that's why, if you really read through this, okay, we know the fact is that Philip VI of Valois is not trying to invade England and then press, territorial rights over England. That's not how it worked out. But England is going to invade France and press territorial rights. We already know that they're going to protect Aquitaine. We also know that at one time they had a bunch of territory in northern France. They might want that back. And then, what the hell? I should be the king of France anyway because my grandpa was Longshanks, but my other grandpa was Philip Capetian. Philip Capet, C-A-P-E-T. All right. Why does in the entire war that starts in 1337, okay, up until 1429, almost the entire war is dominated by England? Can anybody give me a couple of reasons why? Go ahead. Patrick?
You said the French king for years was sort of novel, and the real political power was held by the local lords and dukes because France was decentralized.
Right.
While England itself was sort of like modern England. It was
Right.
It's a country. It's centralized. It has one clear king.
Right.
There's different levels, but the power lies with
Yeah.
the king.
But, England's fighting in a foreign country. I mean, the majority of the people that are going to serve as infantry itself are fighting in somebody else's land.
It already started off owning some of the land in that
Right.
country.
Right. Right. And, if you study the Vietnam War, you kind of understand that North Vietnam was pretty solid together in favor of North Vietnam. South Vietnam had a whole bunch of people that were not really happy that Americans were supporting South Vietnam. So it was kind of like within South Vietnam, you had friends and enemies. And that's kind of what France was at the very beginning. What else?
English had better weapons.
Better weapons. What was it?
The cannon, and then they used the longbowguns.
Yeah. Really, the longbow was it might as well have been like napalm for its time period. Okay. Does everybody know what that, the longbow was? And if you might have seen, like I said, Monty Python's always fun. But Braveheart was pretty good with this too, is that they would just line up these archers. Okay. And it would be like an airstrike where you kind of saturation bomb. And then once you've done the bombing, then you can send your infantry in to deal with it. Effectively, that is kind of what England had at their disposal. The longbow allowed them to shoot from hundreds and hundreds of yards into the field with some pretty good accuracy. Or they would just overwhelm them with arrows. Okay. And then they'd be like, so archers, and then they'd all line up and shoot their arrows. And then they'd be like, cavalry. And then the horses would come in after everybody's kind of decimated. And it's like, send in the reserves. And then that's the fight. Okay. So it's a real mismatch right now because England has the technology, France doesn't. Yeah, France eventually is going to get the cannon. Yeah.
Did English have naval superiority yet? Or was that kind of
There really isn't much of a naval war. Okay, if you really like this battle right here is called Sluice. And if you look at it on a map, it's it would be like D-Day, but 14th century D-Day. right? So that they have established a beachhead and then they continue to land craft. But no, France doesn't really have the weaponry to be able to withstand that attack yet. Gigi?
Uh, a bunch of like French landowners are on the English side.
That's the other big advantage is that yeah, there's people within France that are fighting to support the English, not fight against the English. Yuhan?
So when really powerful, how come the France was able to support like 90 years of
Well, when we talk about the war itself, it's not nonstop. Okay, that's the other thing. They fight a battle or two and then they wait about 6 years and then they fight some more, but it's not like it's constant. Okay. They fought early, like the Battle of Crécy was a huge kind of victory for the English, and they're starting to gain more and more territory. But then the plague breaks out. And so there's not a whole lot of fighting that's going on during that period. And then after the plague is done, then you get the Battle of Poitiers. Then they've got to deal with like domestic problems and a variety of other things, or they're running out of money. England's big thing was every time they wanted to raise armies to continue to fight in France, they needed money to do that. And the English Parliament was going to be the ones that ultimately procured those finances to be able to continue to fight. And sometimes it was easy, and sometimes it was not. Yeah.
What was like an average, I don't know, person, peasants? Like, what do they think about the war? Were they
What would you think? I mean, is there any benefit that you're getting directly? Like, even if the King of England was to take over France, is it really going to change any of the French peasantry's lives?
But those people were not the ones fighting.
No,
So it didn't really affect it in any way.
no,
The war-
no. I mean, they paid taxes to raise the noble-led armies that were fighting on their behalf.
So they didn't really have.
Right. But most of the time, the French response to this was to get savaged by advancing armies. Okay. And that's ultimately, like I told you guys that before, is that you're looking at cruelly wounded people recovering from famine, recovering from plague, now are being required to bring up even more and more finance, more taxes in order to be able to raise a defense. One of the things about the Battle of Poitiers that shows how stupid this whole thing is that the English king is able to capture the French king in battle, but it's not like they're going to kill him, in battle. They're just going to let him hang out in a palace, and then they're going to say ransom. Like if you've ever heard like I had to pay a king's ransom in order to get this thing. It's a figure of speech, but a king's ransom is a lot of money. But where's that money coming from? It's coming from the people, the poor people who are already struggling to survive. And now it's like, yes, new round of taxes, everyone. But the nobles are tax exempt. The clergy are tax exempt. The peasants are going to bear the brunt of that taxation. So you're a French peasant. It's 1356. You have now been asked to pay for King John the Good's ransom. Okay. Half of your territories have been savaged because the English marauding armies that are coming in are basically said, rape and pillage at your leisure. So we have to worry about, protecting our families. We've got to worry about protecting our farms. We don't know if the English kings are going to kill all our livestock and use it as meat, or they're going to devastate our fields and use the grain to subsidize the army. Okay. We don't know if they're going to break into their home and whatever valuables your family might have, they're gone. So that's the big picture part of this is what real benefit are the people getting from this? Okay. In England, they may not have their villages ravaged, although I'll tell you some stories about that later, because a lot of the people like the military that was fighting in England and France, when they got done with their battles and retired home, they missed all of the booty that they were getting when they were in France. So they started, you all have heard of Robin Hood, right? It's a fantasy. They call them fairy tales, where a poor person is going to rob a rich person in order to feed a poor person. The reality is it's the exact opposite. Okay? A rich person is going to rob the poor people and continue to feed the rich people. So Robin Hood is more just a utopian reversal imagination scenario for the English. Okay? that it would be nice if we had a Robin Hood. Instead, what we got is these group called the fur collar criminals, who would go and basically, I'm going to burn your village down, and then like, hey, that sucked, didn't it? How would you like to pay some taxes to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen again? We call that extortion. And that's effectively what it was. Okay. So it's not surprising that after this Battle of Poitiers, where the successor to Edward III, Edward IV, known as the Black Prince, is going to defeat the French king, and then, hey, I think we'll hold him ransom. And the largest uprising that France has, their largest peasant rebellion, is going to be right around the same time. It's called the Jacquerie. Huge, huge peasant rebellion, because it's basically like, poking like a dog or something. It's like, dog like, and then finally it's just going to bite your hand because they can't take it anymore. All right, like how much stuff can you hurl on me before I finally just can't take it? And the nickname for the Jacquerie was like, it was named after this like fictional, like it's almost like a disparaging nickname. It was named after this guy called Jacques Bonhomme, known as Jack Goodfellow. Like he's a good little boy. He does all the work. He pays all the taxes. We kick him in the ribs. He just kind of like, winces, but he kind of gets on with his day. And Jacques Bonhomme finally said, that's not me anymore. Now my name is Jacques, kicks him, what. All right. Okay. Later on then, there's a battle called Agincourt, and this is where things really start to go. If you look at these maps that I included here, you can get an idea of how much of France was controlled by the English, okay, at a certain point. You look at the territories here. All right. But this is one of the bigger ones. And if the territory or the map that we're really looking at is this one here. Okay. Because this is about the extent. Everything that you see in green is the amount of battlefield success that the English have had at the expense. We still have the Duchy of Aquitaine, which that's great. But then they've basically taken all of northern France to the point that they're really close to the capital. Okay. And after the Battle of Agincourt, I wanted to go back to that really quick. Yeah, where is it? No. My bad. There's a little treaty. What was that? Oh, somebody's phone rang. At the Battle of Agincourt was sort of like, that is like France is kind of almost on its last legs. The victory by Henry V, which is the descendants of what began with Edward III, ended up defeating a Charles VI from France. Don't worry about the Roman numerals. Just understand that Henry V is going to defeat Charles VI and then force him basically into a situation where he's going to sign a treaty. And if that treaty goes into effect, basically that once their successors come to power, that the French successor is going to have to recognize the English successor as controlling both territories. It's called the Treaty of Troyes. It doesn't go into effect, but Charles VI's son, known as Charles VII, and prince in waiting is called Dauphin in French. Le Dauphin, that Henry's successor, Henry VI, would ultimately be what Edward was claiming to be at the very beginning, meaning we did it. We had our success. England has defeated France. Now the English throne and the French throne are going to be tied together in the same person, and that's going to be King Henry VI of England. Except Edward's dead. Remember, this is a 116-year-old war. Yeah. Edward's gone. Okay. Then what happens? There's a battle that basically it's a game over. Okay, we win this battle. It's sort of like, it's 3-0 in a best of 4 of 7. If we win game 4, we sweep. The Battle of Orleans is basically game 4, and they're up 3-0 for England. All right. And this is where the most interesting person of this story comes in. Who's that? Joan of Arc. Exactly. So what's her deal? What's her
She's like a teenage girl.
teenage girl? I mean, that's what you expect, right? 15-year-old peasant girl hears voices from angels like Saint Gabriel. What did they tell her?
She's better than you to take.
Huh?
You better get friends back or you will have to take.
Yeah, she basically says, God has told me that Charles VII, the Dauphin, should be recognized as the king. She doesn't say of France. She says of the French. Why is that important?
Because France is kind of small at this point with how much England has control.
It's more about a feeling. The people, the French people. It's the first time, and that's why, like, Joan of Arc was not like some kind of like weird superhero, like Marvel comic, that was like she was a 15-year-old peasant girl about 5 feet tall, and then all of a sudden she's like 7'6" Victor Wembanyama wannabe that could shoot lightning bolts out of her fingertips and kill all the English. She's still that person, okay? But she did 2 things, and she merged 2 of the most powerful forces there is. One is religion, the other is nationalism. So she taught France how to be nationalistic. She said, we're uniting the French around Charles VII, and that God told me. Those are 2 powerful weapons. Okay? So they get to Orleans, and Joan is there, and she's basically kind of bringing the troops together, motivational speeches. They're buying the idea that God sent this emissary to them with some kind of like prophetic thing that said, we're going to be able to defeat the English now. God is with us, and we are the French people, and we are united. And it's like getting the best pep talk ever, to the point where the Battle of Orleans, which was going to be an English route, ends up becoming a French route. All right. The only sad part is Joan is captured by the Burgundians, who are still English allies, and they turn her over to England. And England makes a huge mistake. What is that, Jennifer? What becomes of our poor little Joan? What do you do in the Middle Ages when you want to get rid of, especially a female? They burned her. They burned her at the stake. They gave her a trial. They basically said, you're hearing voices. She's like, yeah, I'm hearing the voices of angels. Okay. And they're like, your hair's really cut short. You trying to be a dude? She's like, no, this is just the way I wear my hair. Right? And then all of a sudden, you have created a martyr, which is not something that you want to do. Yeah.
If she's like the head of the French army, how does she like get captured?
Huh?
Like if she's like the head of the French army, how does she like get captured?
What do you mean? How does she get captured?
Like is she
Like in the battle, they were like, hey, if anybody sees a 15-year-old girl, grab her. Because for whatever reason, they tend to fight harder for her. Yeah, I mean, honestly, in all honesty, I don't know all the details. All I know is that during the battle, the Burgundians found her out. They got her. They captured her. They turned her over to the English, thinking that they were really going to be impressed that their ally like turned over the diabolical Joan. And they brought her up to England to have a trial. Okay, so now you have that trial, and they're basically telling her, like, confess that you're a witch or, some other weird creature. And she's like, will not back down. And they're like, we're going to cut your head off, right? And she's like, you're going to have to do it then, because I'm not lying about what I've heard. Yeah.
What was it? It was just like the king. They did one letters to the king, and then the king was just like, I don't want her.
Yeah, like Charles VII like dissed her.
So
Like when they had a meeting.
So he knew that the significance that Joan had on the French still didn't think that she would be a significant figure to like have around.
Yeah, I mean, chalk it up to just good old fashioned misogyny, you know. But yeah, I mean, she's lower born. B, she's a woman, and a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, Charles did not really do what he could have to try to protect her. But but the people rallied. And when she died, they were like, "Oh my God, you just killed a future saint or whatever the case is." But the French nationalism is what they gave them. They're not thinking about their localities anymore. They're thinking about we're the French. We're fighting for God and country here, and that's a pretty powerful elixir. Okay. Damn, this went a lot longer than I thought it was going to. Okay. Does everybody kind of get what ends up happening then? If I go back to the note you can see this is the map by the time we get to 1453. All right. Because once the French start winning, A, England is exhausted. B, they're broke. They're fighting amongst themselves up in England about who has power. The kings had lost a lot of power to the parliament because the parliament controlled how much finances were going to go into this operation. Now they're losing the operation. The Burgundians are doing the James Harden where they want to find out which team they can finally win with. So they end up signing a treaty with France, even though they've been fighting with England the whole time. And by the time we get to 1453, there's only like one little piece of territory in the very, very north. You see that? It's tiny, but it's called Calais. And it's going to be the only thing that England will possess in France by the time it's done. Okay? So France is effectively has centralized its authority and has expelled England from France. Yeah.
So basically, like this is like a more like I don't know. This is like a worse version of like the Korean War, where they like keep pushing back and then they're just like not really taking any territory.
Well, no, because the Korean War basically ended where it started. So all the slaughter ended up not mattering because you had a 38th parallel that divided the country. The North invaded the South to try to take the rest of the country. The South pushed the North back over the parallel. Then they tried to go all the way to the top, but they settled back at the 38th parallel. This started with France possessing, or England possessing, the Duchy of Aquitaine after having lost over a century all of this northern territory. Then they gained it, okay? And you can see how big Aquitaine had gotten. And then eventually they end up losing everything. So France comes out victorious. If you want to say who won, the French won, okay? Technically. Or you could say who lost? Everyone lost. Because you just put a whole bunch of downtrodden and struggling people through 116 years of warfare that was really over a lot of nitpicky stuff. At least with the French, you could say, well, we understand ourselves as French now, and we have removed an English foreign influence from our soil. And that's that you could say is a victory. Okay. But what the French peasants had to go through to get to that end was rough. Okay. There was a lot of battles. There was a lot of invasions. There was a lot of pillage. There was a lot of atrocities committed against the French people in order to finally get to that space. Yeah. Jazzy?
Right here, it is like after Joan of Arc, basically.
After Joan of Arc, it's like French victories, kind of nonstop. So you could say like the war starts in 1337, but up until 1429, it's English victories. Victory, 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 victory. They hit Orleans. Joan of Arc enters the scene. Okay. They reverse tide in that battle. She's captured. She holds or stands trial. She's burned at the stake. She's a martyr, but the French now have momentum. And then they carry that momentum into expelling the English from all the French territory except for Calais. Okay. Oh, by the way, you don't have to know any of that. Just kidding. Yeah.
Was this like when they started like did the
France start using the cannons and stuff? 'Cause you talked
Yeah.
about how they got them.
Yeah, they had gotten some advanced weaponry so they could protect themselves from invasions, and cannons would do a pretty good job. Okay, and that mitigated the power of the English longbow after a while. But I'm telling you that the real victory, because nationalism has the same substance that religion does. Okay. In fact, like in the age when religion kind of phases out of being like the dominant thing in Europe, nationalism bears most of its characteristics. And it'll make more sense to you as we go through the course. But nationalism appeals to sentiment. Right? You're nationalist in your heart more than maybe you're nationalist in your head. And nationalism is where an individual will make a sacrifice for a larger whole, which is the stuff that religion is really trying to base on. Is I'm taking one because I get some eternal reward, but I also know that I'm a community of believers that believe in a certain thing, and that ties me together with other people. Nationalism is kind of using that same juice, where I have something in common with the people around me, and together we can do really amazing things. And so Joan of Arc is really the first person to really get a notion of French out of the French. Because before that, they wouldn't have identified in that way, which is a hip, kind of cool thing to say. I identify as a French. Oh, well, I identify as a Burgundian. Well, you'll change your mind. You're not going to identify as a Burgundian. Eventually, you'll come our way and be a Frenchman or a Frenchwoman
And before it
or a
was like,
French person.
before it was like identified with someone from this region.
From a duchy, yeah. You know, I am from Brittany, or I am, Anjou, or I am something else, Burgundian. But yeah, you're in a very decentralized state, and you could say that over the course of a couple of hundred years, France is steadily moving towards centralization. Okay, so I guess I'm not going to have time for all of this, but I do want to at least get you started on, when you get to this story, it's at the very end of a story. So at least let me set it up for you. Okay. By the time we get to like 1417, which did y'all read about the Council of Constance or any of that stuff yet? Okay. Did I ask you not to read that for today? And to read the 100-year or the, okay. Yeah. Okay.
That was around like the multiple different popes, wasn't it?
Yes. You guys learn about the schism or any of that stuff? Okay. So the schism is like, we're watching the church kind of like riding a roller coaster. Okay. And at the beginning of that roller coaster, it's not really nearly as powerful as the secular authorities that exist around it. You have kings, you have noblemen, you have emperors, and a variety of other things. And the papacy doesn't really have a lot of clout yet. It has religious clout, but it doesn't have political or secular jurisdiction. But it wants those things. Okay? The Pope wants to really be a papal monarch that controls or basically moves all of the chess pieces that we call Europe. Okay? But it takes a long time for that to happen. Right? But it gets there. So by the time we were looking at, like, say, the early 1200s, the church was at the height of its power. Okay? It could order the emperor from the German states, the Holy Roman Emperor. It could order the King of France, and it could order the King of England at the same time to go on crusades for the church. And no one would ever say, no, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm staying home in England. And the Pope is going to be like, what did you say? They can say, I'm the King of England. I'm going to stay here. I don't need to spend my time in Jerusalem. And they're going to be like, okay, if that's your answer, I'm removing you from all of the sacraments of the church. You're no longer going to have services in England. You are not going to be able to go to heaven. You are going to die, and so are all of your people, and you're not going to achieve salvation. I excommunicate you. You're kicked out. Can't receive the sacraments, can't get communion, can't hear confession. Your kids can't get baptized. You're not getting last rites. I hold the key to you being able to get to heaven. That is an everlasting thing. You're only going to be king of England for like 14 years. So you choose. I control eternity. You control England. Who's going to budge? And you had to create a situation where that happened for the first time. And it happens in the 12th century. It's called the investiture controversy. Okay. And it goes like this is the beginning of the arc. But there was a cardinal who eventually becomes the Pope that is going to have a battle with the Holy Roman Emperor, the one that basically controls the territory that we recognize as modern Germany, modern Austria, and a variety of other territories. And it was over a fight of appointments. So when you invest duties to people, okay, you have a secular leader that will make their princes and their military leaders and their civil administrators, and those are called lay investitures. But when you determine who's going to be the bishops, who's going to be the archbishops, who's going to be the abbots, up until the late 1100s, the emperors or the kings made those choices. Like they come from my backyard, they're my people, I will make those appointments. But then where does their loyalty lie? All of those church officials. If you invest spiritual duties to the spiritual people and you invest lay duties to the secular people, the emperors controlled all of those investments. Until a leader by the name of Hildebrand, who is known as Pope Gregory, comes along and says to the emperor, and it's another Henry just to piss you guys off, okay? They have a battle where the Pope puts out like a document that basically says, okay, it's like Office Space. It's like a memo, all right? Like, here's how we're going to do things from now on. And the Pope throws down this thing that says, from now on, your territory is your territory, but my jurisdiction is my jurisdiction. And that means if you have high-ranking church officials, I appoint them. I'm the one that gives them their duties. I decide who the Archbishop of Meaux or who the Archbishop of Cologne or the Bishop of like Halberstadt. I decide who those people are going to be. Okay? That's changing about 250 years of history. Because you go back to like Charlemagne's grandsons. All of the people that succeeded Charlemagne's grandsons had controlled all that stuff. And so for you to put this memo out, it's changing 250 years of tradition. So the original response from the Salian emperor, the guy that was given the title Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, is, nah. I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but for our purposes, he said, nah. I don't know who this guy is. Oh, he's the Pope. He's like, yeah, but I don't really see him. And it's like, my people are my people, and I know who I want to be the Archbishop of, some cool German state. All right. Nuremberg. All right. I got my guy. And then so Gregory ends up sending him another note that says, perhaps you didn't get my previous note, but from now on, you invest the lay people, I invest the spiritual people. Henry's like, the next response from the Pope is what? Like if some spiritual leader came to you and said, are you Catholic?
Yeah.
All right. So if the Pope called you and said, you are removed from all of the sacraments, you're not going to achieve salvation. Now, Pope Francis is like, I'm really pissed at you. So nobody can talk to her anymore. What if your local priest said that? Do you think that that's it for you? You're a really good Catholic if you are. All right. But if somebody said like, there's people that go to heaven, but you're not going to get to go because I'm kind of ticked off at you right now. Okay. You might laugh at them. You might like, okay. It's like, I talked to God. God got back to me, and God's now pissed at you because I'm pissed at you by proxy. Okay. So no one's going to talk to you anymore. You can't get communion, and you're not going to heaven. If you deeply believe that the church holds the keys to your salvation, and especially back in the 13th or 12th century, you're going to buy that. Okay? So this emperor, imagine the most powerful secular leader in Europe, has found out from the Pope that he is excommunicated from the church. His response was to dress up as a penitent monk, give up all of his possessions, hang out in front of a castle where the Pope was for 3 days in the snow. No shoes, very, very bare vestments. This is an emperor. This would be like, Putin going to visit, like Pope Francis and saying, I'm really sorry for invading the Ukraine, bro. Can you give me that's what ended up happening. Okay, in a figurative, in a literal way, the papacy has the secular leaders of Europe on their knees begging that he don't do this, which is bad grammar. Okay, but it worked. The bluff worked. I throw the excommunication threat. You freak out because you're convinced that he holds the keys to the kingdom. And once the papacy realizes that I can make emperors get down on their knees and beg for forgiveness if they cross me, bruh. So by the time we get past this phase to, his real name is Innocente III. He's like the most powerful pope at the most powerful time in church history is the early 1200s. He's the one that ordered the King of England, the King of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor to go on a crusade to fight against the infidels, which was like weird speak for there's a whole bunch of money out there and we want some of it. How many crusades were there? They started in 1095. They ended in 1291 with the fall of Acre, which was the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. So about 200 years. What was Christianity's record in the Crusades? There's 9 crusades. How many did the Roman Catholic Church, supported by the Pope, who ordered basically said, God has ordered you on these crusades. You will recapture the Holy Land for the true faith. Okay? Christianity versus Islam, what's the record at the end? No. Catholicism finishes with a 1-7-1 record. They won the first crusade. They think that the fourth crusade or the third crusade was a tie. They lost all the other ones. And the fourth crusade, they didn't even go to Jerusalem. They went to Constantinople to gain control of the trade routes. All right. If you are the head of the Catholic Church and you are basically saying, I am God's representative here, can you finish with a 1-7-1 record? Aren't people going to look at you and kind of say, bro, I thought you were the all-powerful Oz. All right. You're in last place in our division, in the church division. That is sort of the background of what you guys are reading about when we get to the decline of the church. All it is, the schism, the Babylonian captivity, everything that you read about is literally Philip the Fair. Same guy, remember? Grandpa that started the 100 Years' War wanted to fight against the papacy and their power and say, you can't tell me what to do anymore. And that's how it's going to play out. All right? Look, just before you guys go, remember, read through this stuff. The screencast will be posted. If you guys have any questions for me, bring them on Monday. Okay? And I'm just going to take Monday to answer questions about the rest of the chapter, and I'll probably take the time to explain the rest of this stuff too. All right? Don't forget Sunday night, those PSDs are due.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a good weekend. I know it's Wednesday, but I won't see you.